Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Folks, welcome back to the show. This is your host, Pat Flynn. Today is the segment Ask the Ethicist, and we have our resident bio-ethicist, Peter Koch, joining us again. Peter, thanks for taking the time.
Thanks, yeah.
We don't need to hide anything. We've been sitting here chatting for like a good half hour before, just catching up and musing things. And we decided, all right, well, enough is enough. We'll just hit record and start getting stuff on tape. And you said that you've been, as philosophers often do, contemplating that deep and important question of death. That sounds like a lively note to begin upon.
Yeah, a little depressing, but doesn't have to be. Yeah, because we were talking about before we hit record, we're just like, what are some topics in ethics that come up? And one of the ones that I was kind of reading on earlier today was whether or not death is bad for you.
Mm-hmm.
The classic puzzle is kind of stated succinctly by Epicurus, and the general idea is if there's no afterlife, and death is supposed to be bad for you, then how can your death be bad for you if you cease to exist upon death?
Mm-hmm.
So on the one hand, everyone thinks death is like the worst thing that will happen to you, but on the other hand, if you cease to exist upon death, then you never experience your own death, and death cannot be bad for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Socrates sort of echoed that sentiment at one point as well, didn't he?
Yep. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, it's an interesting puzzle, because a lot of take in a hospital, for example, a lot of decisions are made around either the avoidance of death, or, for example, in euthanasia, death being a benefit. But it's hard to see how death could be a benefit if you're not there for the benefit. Usually, if you're going to say that your life goes better, you better be around for your life to go better.
Yeah. Unless death is, unless euthanasia is ushering you off to more exotic pastures.
Greener pastures. Yeah, if you have an afterlife, then these problems don't exist. Other problems might exist, but not these particular ones. But if you don't, then you got some questions. I mean, actually, one of the big ones, like kind of a sub problem that comes up, is the timing problem about when is death a harm or when is death bad for you.
Mm-hmm.
So some people argue that it's bad for you after death. First, you can try to make that work in different ways. Other people argue that there's no particular time when death is bad for you. It's complicated, as you can see, you know.
It is complicated, but it always goes back to like, can you really separate? It's like the epistemological question, right? Can you really separate the epistemological from the metaphysical? And can you really separate the ethical from the metaphysical?
Well, so in this case, what do you mean by the ethical from the metaphysical? In other words, can we separate what actually exists in the world at a metaphysical level, like afterlife, etc., from the way that we treat people, like that sort of thing?
Well, yeah, for me, so I mean, for the epistemological, right, the classic, and we were talking about this before, one of the, difficulties with naturalism is, if our rational faculties are only arising from irrational means, then do we really have any reason to trust that we actually have rational faculties? And we kind of get caught in this sort of self-perpetuating skepticism. But, however, if our rational faculties have arisen from rational means, then maybe they're generally reliable. So you kind of have to consider the metaphysical questions, I think, if you really want to have a consistent channel for epistemology. And for me, it seems similar with ethics, because we are considering how we would answer these questions would vary hugely on whether or not we think that only physical things exist, or are we perhaps going somewhere after this? And so my inclination when these things get up is like, well, let's like try and back up a bit and like think about that afterlife question, because that's going to really change things, at least for me. But I guess, for you and in academia and hospitals, obviously not everyone's coming from a religious point of view, or even especially the same religious point of view. So I guess that's a problem in and of itself. But, putting aside any, I guess, secular bias, how do you feel about that? Like just like segmenting the two, because I mean, at least for Aquinas, it didn't seem like he separated his ethics from his metaphysics. Like his ethics was directly grounded in his metaphysics, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it is, you cannot really make sense of just, you essentially, you can't only work, for example, in epistemology and ignore metaphysics and like what it means to be a human being, etc. Mm-hmm. What the world is made of and all that stuff. All these fields overlap, and even the distinction between fields can get pretty, fuzzy at times. Mm-hmm. Like a philosopher, even though maybe someone's trained to be a metaphysician, they of course have to have these other fields in mind as they're navigating through. And some philosophers are so comprehensive that they are really like a philosopher in the true sense, like this really broad, pulling in all these pieces together, like Socrates, Aristotle, Aquinas, etc. Mm-hmm. I don't think that you can really do philosophy, so to speak, focusing just on one field and ignoring all the others. I don't think that's what a philosopher really is. But yeah, going back to the other question of like how to deal with all these different perspectives in a hospital, when some people believe in afterlife, others don't. Some people might believe in reincarnation. Some people believe that suffering is a part of life that's necessary. You do have all these varying perspectives, and they really become manifest at end of life decisions. That's why the whole death thing is so important, because that's when people's values really come out, and their view of what death is and how that fits into life becomes the most sort of salient.
So I'm trying to think of how best to approach this then. So, well, first off, I guess if you were in if Peter Koch were in charge of everything, how would you propose that people go about making ethical decisions and thinking, well, let's stay on death, or thinking about death?
Well, they're kind of two distinct questions: the ethics of it, and then thinking about death. Because on the one hand, thinking about death is just like a conceptual thing, like what is death? How might our well-being fluctuate? While dying, death, and then afterwards. And then there's a question of how do we weigh your well-being or your value, etc. And those are the ethics questions. So like one is like what the actual value, well-being, what death is, all that stuff. Mm-hmm. And then there's the weighing of it all. So if I had to say, how should you think about death? That's a good one. I mean, so there's also like different ways of approaching it. From like an institutional standpoint, probably a sort of the way that a liberal system is run, where people are allowed to have their own sort of perspectives and match their perspectives within like a reasonable range of perspectives, match their perspectives with their means of obtaining certain ends. Mm-hmm. So it's a kind of, like I said, sort of a liberal society. But I think the most important thing would be like making sure people have properly reflected on what death means to them and what dying and the period before death means to them, and how they can fit the pieces of their life together in a cohesive way. So that like idea of cohesiveness is more important than particular ethical principles.
At
least if I were running a really like big, place, which is kind of how a lot of places are run.
Yeah. So I want to go back to the Socrates thing, because I remember back when I was in the ethics class that I was taking when this brought up. I forget exactly how Socrates was. It was before he was about to swallow poison, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he gives his little, I guess, eulogy, you could call it. He's like, hey, screw you guys, because you're just there's only two possibilities here. You're either taking me out of the pain of this world and nothing after that, so thanks, suckers, or you're ushering me off to a better place, right? That's kind of the the gist of it. Obviously not he didn't say it so eloquently as I did, but and I remember proposing to the teacher, I'm like, well, that seems like kind of a false dilemma, because it seems like there could at least logically possibly be some other alternatives there. Like maybe he could also reincarnate as a corn snake, and that isn't so great.
Yeah.
Or perhaps he could be going off to another place, but maybe that other place also isn't so great for other reasons. So, he kind of gives us two options, but I think there's some room between the horns in Socrates' field there. And there was no response to what I said to that.
That's hilarious. Yeah, I agree. Because it's also, because I said before, like, as long as people are reflective about what death is, and I think the way that we're kind of wired, if you're well enough equipped to think about these things, then people will end up with a range of views that's generally, I think, probably fairly reasonable. But it is a range of views. It's not just one or the other,
There was a study that was done recently. You probably are familiar with it. What is the terrible long term they came up with it? Moralistic therapeutic deism. You know what I'm talking about?
No, moralistic therapeutic deism.
So the study, I went to assess what people's kind of general religious belief is, and even people who identify with a specific creed, Christian or otherwise, or even people who were brought up in non-religious households, even atheist households. They found that the common denominator for people, and you probably, I'm sure, have dug into some research or know yourself and maybe can affirm this. I'll look up the study and link to it, but I've heard a few people talking about it recently, is that people sort of generally believe in this sort of therapeutic moralistic deism. And the gist of it is that they believe God exists, but he's relatively in kind of a deistic God. He's kind of a hands-off type of God. Mm-hmm. And that so long as if you're just a good person, meaning like you're not Hitler, like, so their idea of good is very, very vague, then you will go to heaven. And that's pretty much people's beliefs, at least in I think this was an American study. Is that
yeah, no, that's,
would you be able to affirm that?
So I can't give you any numbers, but I know that huge majority. I want to say it's like close to 90% of people believe in broadly like a timeless universal spirit, that where like the traditional idea of God would be like a subcategory of that.
Mm-hmm.
Like most people believe in like the supernatural in some sense, and usually like a single entity that is God.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And then I think a lot of people think that there's a huge framework for like what it means to be good, and a lot of people think that this is not it, that there's life after death. I don't know what the exact numbers are, but I know like the that I can't remember the phrasing they use, but like the universal spirit or something like that as the broadest.
Sure, a little bit of life force going on.
Yeah, like life force, something like that, is like 9 out of 10 or something.
Well, the funny thing that because people like, oh, I did some research on this, and they're like, especially in other countries that start to become less religious, and they'll be like, oh, look, they're becoming more atheistic. If you then run surveys to ask if they believe in a life force, it inverses. The people who drop religion, they really just pick up paganism is what seems to happen.
Yeah.
They don't become atheists. They just become pagans.
Yeah, totally.
Mm-hmm.
No, it's a rejection of organized religion that it doesn't shift towards like a rejection of the idea of God or a rejection of like a life that has meaning beyond the world in front of us. It just goes to we're a super pagan culture.
Yeah, and so I would argue it's just like you're not becoming more religiously sophisticated at that point. You're becoming it's less.
Yeah. No, it's funny. I mean, it's like everyone has to we just have to like refigure things out over and over and over, you know? Generation to generation, sort of.
Yeah, and like certainly there's value in authenticating your beliefs. I found the what I was looking for. It is moralistic therapeutic deism, and it's a term that was introduced in the book Soul Searching: The Religious and Spiritual Lives of American Teenagers by sociologists Christian Smith and Melinda Lindquist Denton. So fairly recent study.
Yeah.
And moralistic because it has a moral component, even though it's vaguely moral, you know, like if you're just not Hitler. Deism because God is, you know, mostly indifferent, kind of stays out of things, but gives you something to look forward to so long as, you know, you're not like, you know, Jeffrey Dahmer or somebody.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I actually just pulled some up here too. Pew Research from 2008, and it's like, looks like 90% are saying 92% God or universal spirit of adults, and then you got like women are significantly more likely. Afterlife, 3/4 of Americans believe in an afterlife.
Mm-hmm.
Among the unaffiliated, about half believe in life after death. So those who aren't religious, half still believe in life after death.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's very interesting to me.
Yeah. And I'm going through this really quickly, so I might be, but 3/4 of U.S. adults, they believe in heaven, but only 60% believe in hell. Huh.
Mm-hmm.
Some good stuff in here.
Yeah, no, so these studies fascinate me, and then it's interesting because, you know, I don't dive into you know all the details of how they're conducted, but it really is fascinating to see where, you know, and I'll try to link to some of this in the show notes if I remember, where, you know, you look at the decline in specific denominational affiliation and almost to the, you know, exact inverse, the rise in adoptions of things like a universal spirit, for example.
Yeah. I mean, I'm looking at this right now. It's 70% of U.S. adults believe in angels and demons that are active in the world.
Yeah, so that's really interesting because like people will not call themselves Christians, but then they'll still go out and buy books on angels.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of people who are super into like ritual religious practices.
Like, look at Burning Man, like.
Yeah, no doubt. No, it's pretty interesting actually. We're all like, I mean, there's this obviously super strong pull in us to connect and make sense of the world beyond the world in front of us, and it just is always going to be manifest. I don't know.
Well, it goes back to, and it's something I said on the podcast many times before. It's like you're not going to not have a religion, especially if we just define it as ultimate commitment, which I think isn't a bad way to look at it. So it's not like you can't not be religious. The only question is, are you going to pick the right religion? Are you going to get it right or not?
Yeah, no, I hear you. And I think people's fear is like getting it wrong. So the idea is going so vague that you like can't get it wrong. Essentially, believe, you know what I mean? Like believe in a universal spirit and say, you have your ethics be like live a good life.
Yeah, which is
against that.
Well, I think you can, like, because, you know, it's kind of the religious pluralism, right? Well, all religions are true, right? That's what they'll say, right?
Yeah.
But then, you know, if all religions are true, my religion says that just my religion is true, and another religion says that just that religion is true. But you say all religions are true, so which one of those is true?
Yeah, no, I mean, you get like divisive figures like Jesus is great for among, because of the reasons where you either have to like accept that Jesus was God, in which case you reject many other religions, or you don't, in which case you reject Christianity.
Yeah, you're gonna be rejecting something
Yeah,
at some point.
you're gonna say one of these is wrong. Yeah, but it's nice because it sorts through things and requires an ultimate commitment that has more detail than be good and believe in a universal spirit.
Yeah, but the point you make is a really good one because people try and find that cop out, right? Where it's like, okay, I don't want to commit. I don't want to do the hard work of trying to think this through to see if anyone is right. So I'm just going to become. I'm going to pick up Aldous Huxley's Perennial philosophy book, and I'm just going to run with that, right?
Yeah. Okay.
Which I was a fan of for a while, when I was before I became Catholic, the perennial philosophy. I'm like, okay, yeah, it's good, but then you actually start to study the world religions, like, oh, now these make serious, often contradictory claims with one another.
Yeah, I mean, they're not. It's no joke. Like the beliefs are pretty. I mean, they're explicit. They're detailed. A lot of them are like you believe it or you don't. There's no real middle ground. You start to like realize what you're either accepting or rejecting, what your options are. It's kind of kind of like you're punting if you just step back and say, I believe in, this. I believe in spirits and I believe in good, and that's about it,
And angels. Everybody we reject. Nobody wants to let go of angels for some reason.
Yeah. But
everybody likes angels, but it's a very modern idea of the angel too.
Yeah, they're amazing.
But Aquinas had a lot to say on angels. We'll have to do an episode on the angels at some point.
Yeah, angels are great, and I on the other hand, like it's also a process. I think like people are whatever word that people use, like the spiritual journey or whatever. So like you kind of find people at different points of where they are, like what commitments they're willing to engage with. So I'd be curious to see is if there's anything about age in these studies. Like if you're an older person, do you have more like detailed commitments? Are you more likely to be a member of an organized religion and be less pluralistic than when you're? It wouldn't surprise me if something like that happened too.
It does. I think that is sort of the trend, is that it's people do become a little bit more committal as they age.
Yeah.
So, go ahead. You go ahead.
Quick. The other thing that and I get this a lot just in conversations about religions, etc. It's like, well, this is how you were raised, but do you want to settle that one real quick because
the old genetic fallacy?
Yeah. It's an annoying one to hear.
Yeah. So because all right. So let me just state it, right? Oh, Peter, you're only Catholic because you're a Catholic. But if you were born in Pakistan, you'd be a Muslim, or if you're in Portland, Oregon, you would have been an atheist. So right, that's typically the trope that you'll hear trotted out.
Yeah. But it's clearly wrong for many, many reasons. There's counterexamples of people who, I've brothers and sisters all raised in the same home with different beliefs, right? So you just have empirical counterexamples of why that's just not the case. And go ahead.
It's funny that you brought this up because the post that I shared with you the other day, I responded to this because, first off, I did not have a religious upbringing, and for a very long time I was quite anti-religious. But it's really just it's the genetic fallacy where you think that if you can explain how somebody came to hold a belief, you can explain that belief away or invalidate or validate that belief. Yeah. But how somebody comes to hold a belief is wholly independent of whether or not that belief is true or false. Mm-hmm. I might think that democracy is a superior form of government to monarchy, and I might think that just because I was brought up in America, but that doesn't say one way or another whether or not that belief is true. Right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it might give us some insight as to why you think it, but it is independent of true, like you're saying. Yeah. Anyway, just get that out of the way real quick.
So let me ask you this, because you do something that I don't know if I would be able to do. So you're a professional bioethicist. You know, you're a professor. Now you're at a Catholic university. But if I was doing what you were doing, I don't think I could just be a philosophical ethicist. I think I would have to be a Catholic ethicist. Do you get what I'm saying? And I guess the great thing about the Catholic tradition is, you know, we have the natural law. So as a philosopher, I guess you could just be like a natural law ethicist and pretty much all the Catholic conclusions. But how do you, and now this is just like a personal question, right? Like, how do you go about it? How do you because you are Catholic, but you're also a philosopher, but you're doing work in space that is maybe not conducive to just people hearing of a religious, ethical viewpoint, even if we would both argue that it's the right one, right? So just give me your experience with that.
Yeah. So, I mean, you have like traditional ethical theories, which, you know, I think in any setting, whether it's a Catholic university, a Jewish university, a secular university, should be presented because they capture the way that human beings kind of naturally think about ethical dilemmas and ethics. And then, so that, I mean, it doesn't invoke religion, but it does a lot of the concepts that are important to these ethical theories. For example, the intrinsic worth of the human being. These concepts overlap with what are central to religious ethical frameworks. The worth of the human being, like a huge one for Catholic bioethics, and for like a deontological approach, like a Kantian approach. So you get a lot of overlap, and what it actually does is, I always teach I always show the overlap between Catholic bioethical or Catholic ethics and secular ethical framework, because and it benefits people who are both religious and not religious, because they see how like ethical frameworks that are put out by a church or by a religion, they're not simply just like statements that are unconnected or non-philosophical. They actually just parallel so-called strictly philosophical ethical frameworks. So it's like, I think a lot of people have the impression that ethics as, or I should say religious ethical frameworks, they're like these floating list of commandments that don't have any philosophical or argumentative structure.
That are just more or less arbitrary, right?
Yeah, they're like more or less arbitrary. But if you look at the actual structure of these religious frameworks, their structure is very similar to non-religious frameworks. You have tons of overlap between them. So it's good to be able to recognize like how to think about things and how thinking about things applies to secular and non-secular conversations.
So, sorry, don't let me interrupt. Keep going.
So basically, it's easier for bioethics too to talk about, to balance religious and non-religious things like Catholic and non-Catholic, because, or I should say it's easier in bioethics to talk about religious bioethics, Catholic bioethics, because a lot of bioethics traces back to the Catholic Church. And a lot of hospitals are Catholic hospitals, so you need, like, you should know Catholic bioethics, even if you are adamantly not Catholic. 6 out of, or no, what is it? I want to say like 1 out of every 6 beds in the world hospital beds is run by a Catholic institution. It's the largest provider of healthcare. Yeah.
So you know, the church, despite, you know, it often being mired in scandal, it does do some good things, doesn't it?
Largest single entity, or largest single humanitarian entity in the world, Catholic.
So let's if you wouldn't mind, because people have asked me to do this. This has been a requested topic where we go through a couple different ethical frameworks or systems and explain what they are and critique them. I did an episode, so I'm doing the series on the 10 Commandments now. And what I'm trying to do, which I'm sure you would be very helpful on, is trying to show how the Ten Commandments really do parallel the natural law, or that which we can't not know, and are often just, specific revelations or instances of these sort of, deep moral intuitions that we already have, even if they aren't infallible, right? Mm-hmm. So we've, I've had people ask about utilitarianism and deontology and a few, and like how to kind of work through assess these various ethical frameworks. So maybe you have an idea of where to start, but the thing that, kind of first came up to me is, immediately when we're starting with ethics, that question of this kind of intrinsic value of the human person, like, how do you even get ethics off the ground? I mean, without just arbitrarily assuming that, which, as a philosopher, like that's unacceptable. You just don't arbitrarily assume anything, right? Like, where is that grounded? And how do you pull that away from metaphysics? And then, like, how does that not just draw you right back into religion? And I get that a lot of people are probably okay with just assuming that as a starting point. And that's where I guess I could agree with a lot of humanist philosophers and atheistic philosophers. Like, okay, yeah, if we could agree on this starting point that humans have intrinsic worth, we probably could deduce a lot of the same principles and moral processes of decision making that we could agree on. But my problem that I would have with you, Mr. Humanist, is that you're just being completely arbitrary and thinking that humans have objective moral worth to begin with. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah. I mean, the question of what makes things valuable is such a difficult thing to answer in general, because we have a tendency to, like, I mean, you have this question of, like, what would count as proof of something being valuable? Mm-hmm. That in itself is really, really tricky, because it's a different kind of proof from the proof that we're used to for other kinds of knowledge. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I mean, I think everyone has any ethical theory has a problem of the stipulation of value somewhere. So some, like hedonism, for example, says that, the basic good in the world is pleasure, and then the basic bad is its opposite, pain. Mm-hmm. But it can't tell you about why the pleasure of you is more important than the pleasure of a cow or something like that,
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So that you're still gonna get questions about how do we, like, what is the value of the things that have pleasure or pain in the first place? Mm-hmm. And that's always tricky. So it really is a really difficult question about why things are valuable and where the value comes from. What does it even mean for value to come from something else? If it's
Are you're throwing that one at me?
Oh, I'm saying that it's like a
because I'll take it. I'm ready.
You knocked it out.
Well,
these are like the questions that really fuel debates about ethics. A lot of people to consider value theory or axiology to be the same thing as ethics, because it's all about value and weighing things.
Yeah, and I know we were talking maybe a few months ago, like, about Kant, where he would just try and ground it all in reason. But for me, it's like, when it comes to morality, there's two things I guess we really have to consider. One are moral values, like what makes something morally good or morally bad. Mm-hmm. And then there's also duties, what makes something right or wrong. So if we want to say that, humans have objective moral value or objective moral worth, then that value has to be valid and binding apart from any of our opinions, preference. Mm-hmm. It has to be apart from us, really, right?
Yeah, which
means it can't just be grounded in our reason, which Kant wanted to do, right?
Well, so it's not grounded in our reason. The sense of reason is like a process or like an activity, or like even like a tool. It's grounded in rational nature. So like the nature that we have, and the way he describes the nature that we have is he uses the term rational, because it like distinguishes it from other natures that things have.
See, and this right here is the problem, I think, with Kant, because you have 12 different people to teach Kant, and none of them teach the same thing.
I know. They say there's for every like whatever 40 words of Kant, you have 15 different interpretations.
It's so true, because when I was going through the Kant stuff, right, and like it's so hard to make heads or tails of, but the professor was insistent on that it's just reason is its own dictator, right, and that you just have a moral obligation to not contradict yourself. But then she could of course never argue for why you have a moral obligation not to go against your own reason, which would just be circular from right.
Yeah, so it's when you use reason, it can be like ambiguous. So the rational nature is we are the kind of thing that have reason, and that is the thing with the unconditional value, intrinsic value, that dignity. Mm-hmm. And reason itself. So when Kant talks about the categorical imperative, he is talking about not contradicting, not willing things that are contradictory or would kind of create. There's different forms of the categorical imperative, but basically, yeah, not willing things that would
lead to absurd outcomes.
That would where the means would contradict the ends.
Mm-hmm. And just for everybody listening, we are now talking about deontology.
Yeah. So because we are rational, we have sort of access to morality, and we, as rational beings, kind of are bearers of the intrinsic value in the world. That makes sense.
This is why the Enlightenment thinkers, man, the Enlightenment was just a bowl of soup. It's just
what's the soup?
like where is the clarity of Aquinas and Aristotle and people like Kant and especially Hume, right? I'm like, man, I also get so frustrated with the Enlightenment thinkers. And I do try to go back to Kant. I really do. Professor Koch, I really do try to keep going back to him. I just can't.
It really
do it.
He's like bred. I mean, there are philosophers who've pretty much made their names in philosophy through the interpretation of Kant. He's like bred multiple interpretations of his own work.
Yeah,
it's like you're a Kantian philosopher. You have your own distinct view of what Kant said, and that makes you different from another philosopher who's also Kantian, who has their own distinct view. I mean, that's why it's like when you say, what did Kant say? It's like, well, whose view are you adopting?
Mm-hmm.
You know?
So I guess, the thing that we certainly agree on is that if he says, yeah, there's something about human nature, and something about human nature involves us being a rational animal, but that is intrinsically valuable, we would still need a foundation for an explanation for what makes humans intrinsically valuable. And that brings us back to sort of the objective question again. If we have values and duties, what are the possible foundations? And this is where, kind of way back to what we were talking about before, is how can we really separate the ethical from the metaphysical? Because now we're asking an ontological question. And the only three sort of possible, I guess, explanations that I think are on the table, and you can certainly fill me in if I'm missing one here, is that one is that if you're a naturalist, there isn't any objective moral value of humans. We're just slightly more evolved primates hurling through space on an infinitesimal speck of dust, doomed to individual and collective oblivion. So any value we try to ground in ourselves is just speciesist, right? We just happen to like ourselves more than anything else. We don't really have objective moral value, and certainly no such thing as obligations, because where would that ever come from apart from ourselves? So there's that, which is really just nihilism, which falls out of atheism. Then you have, I think we could have Platonism in there, right? Where there's sort of some abstract realm where things like forbearance and justice just kind of exist out there somehow, But that, I think, reduces to incoherency, because how would we ever, like, if like I'm acting justly, how does, like, what's the causal mechanism there? How do I detect? I think it's unintelligible completely. And certainly I don't have a moral obligation to an abstract object. That's just weird. And then the only other possible option that I can think of is that it's grounded in God, or it comes from God. God is the source of moral values, himself being the absolute standard of goodness, and an obligation follow from his commandments, will, the natural law, which are just a reflection of his essentially good character, etc. Am I missing anything there? Those kind of pool of live options, and would you care to comment?
It's tricky because you have, like, I mean, one is that when we talk about what it means for something to, like, to have obligations. An obligation is, in a sense, it relates you to a good, or prevents you from doing an evil. Like, you have obligations for things or against things.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, I think we just have to be careful about what, I would say, before talking about obligations and all these things, like, do obligations exist? I think we can, because you said, like, do we have an obligation to an abstract entity out there, you know, or like a platonic form or something like that? What would that even mean? Obligations are secondary or derived from the goods that are already there.
Mm-hmm.
But we can just restrict it to asking, what are the goods? Like, what are the things of value in the world? And that's, like, the basic question. And then I think those three general things, I mean, it's so, like, it might be that, and this is kind of a Thomistic view, is that the good is being and God is, like, ultimate being.
Mm-hmm.
So the three are connected. And
and that's kind of like falling out of his third way of degrees of being, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And I'm very much partial to that way of thinking myself.
Yeah, no, I hear you. But then someone could say, like, why is being good? But you see how fundamental these questions are getting at this point? You know, it's like where we have being, goodness, and maybe goodness doesn't tell us anything beyond what being would tell us.
Well, even before I was a Catholic, I was very attracted to the Thomistic way of thinking because, you know, for Aquinas, anything that exists is good in and of itself. And then God is sort of like, trying to think of the analogy here. Maybe it's like, you know, sort of our moral sense in a way, and the things that we think are good. It's kind of like a high fidelity recording, where a high fidelity recording is in relation to a symphony, right? It's an approximation to something where, you know, God would be that symphony or that source or that absolute standard of goodness. And then everything is a degree of, in relation to that perfection, right? That's kind of what you're going at with the Thomistic view, right?
Yeah. So then exactly. So, like, the goodness in the world just is being, is like, isness or whatever, and there's no separate realm of the good that's distinct from, like, what the world is.
Yep.
But then in order to get, like, why is being good, I mean, how is that question even answerable? You know what I mean? I
think it's helpful in the extent that you can't really think of where being is bad, but then where he makes the, I think, awesome distinction, and Aquinas obviously wasn't the first one to do this. It was partly what brought Augustine away from Manichaeism too, is to think more about what is evil or what is bad. And then what you find is that evil or badness is just a hole where goodness should be, where something that should be instantiated or existent just isn't there, right?
Privations and etc. Yeah. No, it's a really interesting view of the world. It really simplifies. There's only one thing in the world, and then there's privations of that thing, and then good and evil, etc. But it's all one big thing, and then that's all. It all, like, kind of participates in what God is, which is ultimate, pervasive, eternal being.
Yes.
that
Yes.
framework, and we're actually back to like what people think the world is about, which when I'm talking about like the universal spirit and just being good and just being, like people are naturally attuned to that. It seems like, given the statistics that we talked about earlier in the podcast, you know,
It's extremely intuitive, because when we say like when something is bad, we say like it shouldn't be that way, you know?
yeah,
Like
yeah.
our language is just reflective of like those deeper things we just tried to dissect. Naturally, it's reflective of that.
Yeah. And which is actually why we think death is bad, pulling in that other part, because it seems, even though it happens to everyone, it still seems like not right. It's a hole in the structure of the world and being.
Yes, yeah. So look at that. We were able to tie it back together.
That worked out well, actually.
But yeah, I mean, it's just, my goodness, we could go on forever here, but let's try and maybe like tie it back into something, because we did definitely go drift into the metaphysical there, which is, again, like we're trying to answer ethical questions, but like I always get pulled back to those metaphysical questions to try and
they're really, I think, essentially one and the same. You really can't answer ethical questions without metaphysical commitments in the first place.
Yeah, and I guess if you have enough people that could just agree on or assume a starting point, like humans have objective moral worth, sure, we can have various competing theories, but that's just assuming that there aren't going to be people out there who aren't moral nihilists. But there are moral nihilists.
Yeah, exactly. And there are a lot of more. Yeah, there are moral nihilists, and there's also people who think that the worth of humans is equal to the worth of all other things that can feel pleasure and pain, and that's how you get destroying the earth. Or destroying human beings for the sake of the other things that exist, for the pleasure of the other things that exist. Something along those lines, which we were talking about before we hit record.
So, yeah. So maybe, I mean, that's a whole nother,
separate. Yeah,
that's a whole nother conversation in and of itself. But all right. So I did promise some people we would talk about, at least, even if it's just briefly here, because I don't want to keep you all night. Some various competing moral theories. We tried to, the bowl of soup that is Kant. We didn't get very far there. But it is useful, like the categorical imperative and his hypothetical imperative. It's really just like, moral versus prudential values, I think, is an easy way to think of that. But what about like natural law theory? Because, that's always, it was in fact natural law theory that really led me to start to consider Catholicism, because I'm like, this just makes so much sense. And I'm like, oh, wow, this is just everything that the Catholic Church teaches.
Yeah. So, I mean, why don't I just say real quick about consequentialism, utilitarianism real quick, just to contrast it to deontology?
Yeah. So yeah, we're in your Ethics 101 class. You're just giving us the summary and whatever you would do.
Okay, cool. So different ways of answering the question, what is the right thing to do, which is the fundamental, I guess, question of ethics. So you're wondering what the right thing to do is and what the wrong thing to do is. And there are different ways of telling what the right thing to do is and the wrong thing to do is. Some people base it on the consequences of your action. So they say, look at the act and look at the consequences of what will happen. Mm-hmm. The consequences are more good consequences than bad consequences. Then do that act, or that act is permissible. If there's more bad consequences than good consequences, then the act's impermissible. So then, of course, you're going to ask, well, what's a good consequence? What's a bad consequence? How do I know what's good and what's bad? And the classic answer to that is that a good consequence is one that causes happiness to the relevant parties, and a bad one is one that causes the opposite, which is either suffering or pain. So that's what utilitarianism is essentially. Mm-hmm. Greatest happiness principle is an act that causes most happiness is the one to do, in proportion to less pain.
Correct. Now, if you wouldn't mind, since we're just kind of giving a summary, and obviously we aren't utilitarians or consequentialists, what is the quick critique? What's the quick thing that's And I think most people intuitively like feel like that is wrong. Like they get like you talk utilitarianism for most people, and they're like there's sort of a natural revulsion to it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, I mean, so it has. If you read like John Stuart Mill or Bentham, there's some parts where you're like, okay, that makes sense. You know, like if you have choice A and choice B, and choice A is going to make a lot of people happy and nobody sad, and choice B is going to make a ton of people sad and nobody happy, choice A is the right one to do. Like, everyone would intuitively think that. But then the problem is that one problem is that it seems to justify if you were to make a small group really, really happy at the expense of the rest of the group, but the overall happiness of the small group outweighs the sadness of the rest of the group.
Mm-hmm.
Take a worse example, where, like slavery, for example. If you did a calculus and figured out that more people are happy with slavery than without, then the utilitarian would be like, go with the slavery.
Yep.
No thought for the individual and the value of the individual. It's about doing this big calculus about the group. So that's one of the problems.
And I think that's a kill shot for utilitarianism, because you know if they're saying that what is morally good is whatever equates to the most happiness, like they've made that identity claim, and we can think of even just one example where people will be like, no, it doesn't matter how many people are made happy by slavery or child molestation. Those things are just by themselves morally bad. Then utilitarianism just is false.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean that's the other question. It's kind of a metaethical question. Is so are there some things that are so obviously morally wrong, where if your theory implies that they're correct, then your theory is wrong? Because it kind of makes ethical, like the whole project of finding a good ethical theory, really difficult. Because on the one hand, figuring out the right ethical theory should give you answers about all sorts of ethical problems. But on the other hand, if you're starting with assumptions about the right answers for these ethical problems, then you're kind of working backwards and you're checking your theory against an answer that you already know. So you walk in with a conclusion.
Mm-hmm.
So the overall project of figuring out what an ethical theory is, or what the best ethical theory is a little bit backwards. It's like, on the one hand, what do people know is already right? But on the other hand, what's a theory that can tell us what's right?
Mm-hmm. And that really is the epistemological question then, right?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So
I mean, you just have a lot of stuff going on, like a lot of questions that are always at play.
Mm-hmm. So we can chuck utilitarianism into the trash.
Okay, then you have deontology, which is instead of what the outcomes are, the deontologist says, well, you can't really control outcomes. All you can control is your will. So like the goodwill is what we focus on when we say whether an act is good or bad. What did the actor will when the actor did it? And the will should correspond to rationality. This is where the categorical imperative comes in. So you should do things that, don't treat people as a means to an end. However you want to sort out what duties you have. But the classical one is you obey the categorical imperative, which requires that you will non-contradictory things out of respect for the value that inheres in the rational nature.
Yes.
So there you go. But the thing about that is that it requires that you essentially describe a scenario, and then you say, okay, can I will that, this? Can I will that this be an imperative, or that this be the commandment, so to speak, or the duty? But that requires describing the scenario. And the same scenario can be described in many different ways,
mm-hmm.
which make applying the categorical imperative actually pretty difficult, because you can sort of figure out different ways of describing the same scenario so that some will produce a contradiction, others won't.
So then you just have to qualify it so many times it just becomes like, well, why do we even bother?
Yeah, exactly. So then it gets like, how general should the description be? They call it the maxim. So how general.
So can you give us an example? Like, for the common one is like, you shouldn't steal, because if everybody stole, then nobody would trust anybody, and it would just reduce to absurdity. Is an idea of a categorical imperative, right?
Yeah. So take the stealing one. Like, when you steal, this is the kind of general idea. Stealing is contradictory because you, at the same time, will for something to be your property, and then you have a right to it, but you're also rejecting someone else's claim to property in the act. So you both will that property is recognized and also not recognized. You see, so that's the contradiction.
And like, I'm with Kant, so far, like that's I agree with him that a number of things, when you kind of run them through the Kantian system, will result in contradictions. I guess my problem is there's also a number of ways, like you said, that you can modify the scenarios enough where it seems like, actually that seems like an exception, or it doesn't quite work. But also, like, so what if I like maybe I just want to contradict myself? Why do I have any obligation to be non-contradictory, right?
Yeah, I mean, so for him though, the contradictory thing is interesting because it like collapses on itself. It's not even like just doing a bad thing. It's doing something that is so contrary to what you, and it essentially means you are like pulling yourself in opposite directions. Like there's something inherently wrong with it. Exactly like you said, that you could just say, what if there is nothing wrong with contradictions or anything like this? But it is a pretty profound criticism of an action to say that you're willing opposite things, and you can't hold those two things. Your act is like fundamentally flawed because of contradiction. So it's kind of nice like that. You know what I'm saying?
It is, and I think it works for a number of general instances, but it doesn't work well enough because of what you said before, that there's instances where it's like, actually no, and then we just need to qualify it, and then we need to qualify it again, and we need to qualify it for this instance and that instance. And then eventually it just seems like, well, why are we even bothering, right?
Yeah. So then, exactly. So if, say, you should not steal, even if it will save your life. Like, say you come you find a cottage in the woods, and it's clearly somebody else's property, but you're about to die. Like, is that now a new maxim?
Yes. Right. Because it's a new scenario, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And then what are you going to do? Memorize encyclopedia upon encyclopedia of Kantian maxims? No,
I know, exactly. And Kant wants to formulate, so he gives different formulations of the categorical imperative that help you kind of run scenarios through this little machine of rationality, so to speak. But it is difficult. I think he thinks it can do a lot. He has a whole metaphysics too, he's one of the ones who really tried to get a whole worldview. Some people think that he irreparably screwed up philosophy. Others think he's the greatest philosopher ever.
Yeah, I'm more inclined to that first position. I don't think he did. I think he tried to respond to the skepticism, but I think Adler summarized this well in his book 10 Philosophical Mistakes. I think he nailed it, except for he tried to build coherency out of the previously incoherent skeptical positions, rather than going back to where the mistakes were made by the skeptics themselves.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good assessment, because he was really faithful to having a coherence. His project, he didn't publish until he was like 58. His project was just like years and years and years in the making, and it really was an attempt to kind of address all of those pieces you talked about earlier: epistemology, metaphysics, ethics, morality, and put them together in one like nice cohesive project. But I think he gave too much to earlier precedents that he didn't have to. And then if your foundation is a little off, the whole house is going to be a little crooked. So I think that's what happened.
All right. So so utilitarianism. That's not going to work. Deontology, way too messy. Too many interpretations. Too many qualifications. Too many problems. Kind of doesn't really have the ontological foundations either. Let's give one more. Do you want to talk? We could do a whole episode on natural law theory. I think we should do a whole episode on natural law by itself. But if we were to throw one more out there?
Yeah. Okay. I mean, we can talk about natural law real quick. Usually trace back to Aquinas, and this is the moral law as opposed to like the legal philosophy stuff. But the natural law, it basically ties in morality to the metaphysics of the human person, what a human being is. And human beings are a certain way, and we're essentially, we live in community and we're able to reason, and the way that we behave should correspond with the mandates of reason, the mandates of what we are metaphysically, human beings. Real kind of quick, but that's the way it works.
Yeah. So I guess the idea here is that we are made in the image and likeness of God. Aquinas would certainly affirm that. But even though we could get a lot of, I guess, the foundations for natural law, even just from Aristotle, but the thing that's nice about natural law is you can do so much of the ethical work proximately just by looking at the nature of humans, even apart from the metaphysics, like deontology or something like that. Except for I would say it's much more consistent and coherent. And just looking at teleology of like, okay, well, what are we directed at? What is our aim? Well, we're rational animals. And we use our reason to seek what is good for us, which you said, right? Like working within, the dictates of reason. But then, of course, Aquinas will step in and say, like, well, look, reason is clearly searching for the ultimate good, which is God. Yes. So like, we don't get to, decide what our final end is. Like, our final end is decided for us by the types of creatures we are. We only get to decide if we're going to actually choose to pursue that final end or not, right?
Exactly. So when you answer the question of what is human nature, what are human beings, you're answering the question of what is our end. And that's how what is good is directed towards our end. And we can use reason to work towards that end. But also built into this whole framework is the end it can be known by us, but it's something that science can't answer. It's essentially a theological question. It goes into, kind of being created by God, and our aim is to be essentially reunited with God in a sense.
And what's always was attractive to me about natural law is you look at that there's a teleology within the entire world. So to take the stock example, like the directedness of an acorn is to become an oak. It is good for an acorn to become an oak, right? And once you kind of see what things are pointed at or supposed to be, then we can say, okay, whatever promotes the acquisition of that end, or whatever or whatever doesn't frustrate the achievement of that end, right? That's how we can start to make decisions of good or bad, right and wrong. Now, it's not necessarily like it's not evil that an acorn doesn't become a tree, because an acorn doesn't have reason, so it's not a moral agent, right? But when you have moral capacities, when you have reason, then you are a moral agent. But it's still better for an acorn to become a tree, right?
Yeah.
With natural law. And then like we can just deduce so many things from there, not just like our final end, but also sexual ethics, hard questions, abortion, euthanasia. Like you can, what I found attractive about natural law is how you can just drive it through consistently on pretty much, at least I would say everything. I haven't really found too many places where I've but I'm gonna you take over.
Yeah, I mean, no, I think it's a really it captures, it's very Aristotelian too, just the general the framework. It is Aristotelian, with the idea of the end, and then the good is towards the end, and then asking what is the proper end of the human being. So that's, once that starts to shift around though, like what is the proper end of the human being? That's how you get all sorts of different answers. So like obviously moving the end around means you move everything that the end implies around too.
Mm-hmm.
People disagree about what the end of the human being is, then you're going to get serious disagreement about the ethics of how human beings should behave. So that's one of the, the features of it.
Yes. And, and that's, I think that's sort of a good stopping point where we can pick up next time, because that's kind of where we are today. We're in this relativistic culture where people think things are good just because you want them to be. But Aquinas and Aristotle would say something quite the opposite, that some things just are good by their very nature and the types of natures that we as humans have. And those are the things that you should want. Correct?
Yeah. It's, yep. It's the things that you should want. And most people, because everyone is a human being, but most people are naturally inclined towards these things anyway. And the evil things we do are really perversions of a good drive that we have. We're just trying to achieve the right end, but doing it the wrong way.
Yeah. A good example of a whole where something good should really be.
Yeah. Exactly.
Good. All right. Well, that gives us the topic. Now, on the next episode, we will start to build out natural law theory for the people.
Sounds good. For the people.
Excellent. Professor Koch, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Pat.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.